Brian, I'm going to go ahead and make you host.
Hi. Okay.
Brian?
Or
Brian.
good. Okay, good.
All right, everybody, good evening. I want to apologize first. My boy's grandfather is here, and if they get a little loud in the background, they're downstairs, but I also have somebody outside my window at my neighbor's house doing some landscaping, so it's a very eventful night over here. But to start off, we've got Molly Fitzpatrick here with Root Policy Research to go over the housing needs assessment and provide some time for you guys to ask any questions. And then we also have Chris Brewster here with Multi Studios to kind of follow up with our discussion 2 weeks ago on the bulk plane. And then we've provided at your request, I've got some images to add to his presentation. But let me check first for any citizens for public comment, and then we'll go ahead and get started, okay? Okay, it looks like we're all here. I had to promote John and Noel, but there's no citizens attending right now. So Molly, if you want to go ahead and kick it off.
Great. Thanks, Brian, and hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Obviously, let me know if you have any tech issues. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk us through a slide deck that gives kind of a recap on the housing needs assessment and then also talks about the incentive feasibility analysis. So I'm going to plan to kind of move through it relatively quickly because I know you all have lots to discuss every time you get together. So if I'm moving too quickly, or if you have some questions about something as I go, feel free to stop me. Also, you know, if it's easier, we can also do questions at the end. But feel free to kind of flag me down or slow me down if there's anything you want a little more detail on. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Hopefully you can see a giant blue slide deck right there. As I mentioned, I'm going to recap the housing needs that we identified as part of the housing needs assessment. We're going to talk about some of the recommendations that we've made to the city. Some of that overlaps really closely with the development code. Other elements of it do not, but we're going to talk about what all those recommendations are. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on the feasibility analysis that relates to both incentive feasibility, but also some feasibility related to whether or not the city chooses to do an inclusionary housing ordinance, or also known as inclusionary zoning. So starting with just the top housing needs, and some of you may have seen this before if you listened to a previous city council meeting where we presented these findings, and or if you've actually read the report. But broadly speaking, the housing needs in Inglewood are centered around affordability, product diversity, and stability for households. So generally that means we need more diverse housing options. That's to accommodate kind of evolving needs of residents. That includes both residents who want to age in place, but maybe in a slightly different product context. But also it includes folks that are looking to enter into homeownership and may have different ideas about what that looks like or what structures they're interested in that context. So diverse housing options, additional affordable rentals, like almost everywhere else in the metro. Inglewood does have a shortage of affordable rentals. Even though Inglewood does have relative affordability compared to some of the surrounding jurisdictions, you still have a really strong need when we compare the incomes of your residents to the housing prices that they are experiencing right now. In terms of starter homes, the primary need around starter homes is those that are priced near or below 300,000. That's where we see the biggest mismatch in terms of kind of affordability for folks that would want to become homeowners and what options are available. That 300,000 price point is really hard to hit in terms of new development, in terms of construction prices right now. And so we'll talk about some strategies to get there, even if it's really hard for the private market to supply some of that inventory. And then fourth, additional housing resources to stabilize households with unique or disproportionate housing needs. That includes folks that have accessibility or mobility needs, older adults that may have an increasing need for services, low-income households, and of course, people experiencing homelessness. So that's the high level. I'll run through a couple quick data slides that just kind of help you paint a picture for what pointed us to these needs, and then we'll talk about the solution. So in terms of product diversity, Inglewood is that top bar there. The 14%, that dark blue line, represents the proportion of houses or structures in Inglewood that are what we would call missing middle. So attached product, but fewer than 10 units in the building. So that's relatively low compared to some of your surrounding jurisdictions. Obviously, you all have been working with Chris on solving some of that, or at least creating opportunity for some of that as well. Rental market trends, the rents have risen dramatically over the past 10 years in particular. You can really see some upward shifts in terms of the price points for rentals. Most of kind of the stock that you lost, you had a lot of kind of naturally occurring affordable housing in that $500 to $800 rent range, and those are all but gone as rents have increased. Housing prices, you can see here on this graph as well. Inglewood's the yellow line. You can see really steep increases, particularly since 2012. So in Inglewood, the median market value has actually tripled since 2000. Most of those gains happened just in the past 10 years. So even though Inglewood has been relatively affordable because you have some older housing stock that has historically been manageable for folks, those prices have certainly increased pretty dramatically. There's a lot going on in this slide. I'm not going to spend a ton of time, kind of piecing through it, but broadly speaking, as part of our analysis, we do what's called a housing gaps analysis, where we look at the incomes of folks who are currently living in Inglewood, and then how does that compare in terms of their incomes and what they can afford for housing? How does that compare to your actual housing prices and where there are mismatches among those two groups? And really what we find in the rental market is we've got really acute mismatch for households that are earning less than 30% of area median income, or AMI, but still some additional shortage for those that are earning up to 50% of AMI. And then on the ownership side, big gaps in that 30 to 80% AMI range, but those gaps really persist up to about 120% AMI. So that's important as we start thinking about incentives and where do we target those, what kind of housing are we trying to create, and what price points are we trying to hit? Oh, that was not supposed to be the end of the slideshow, guys. Hang on one second. Sorry, hang on. Apparently I've hidden slides accidentally, so we're gonna unhide those and jump into the actual recommendations that we have proposed to the city of Inglewood to help address some of those needs. So when we think about approaches to addressing these needs, we usually think about 4 different categories of these types of tools. One is funding. So what money can we throw at this problem? Building. So how can we increase production of affordable and workforce housing? Preservation. how can we preserve the naturally occurring affordable housing that we have, as well as the income restricted affordable housing that we already have? And then how can we assist households directly who may need either unique or targeted or specific types of assistance? So the actual action items that we've recommended, there's 9 of those that we recommended to City Council. They all kind of fall within those buckets or kind of approaches that I just mentioned. And I'm just going to kind of blitz through these. I'll highlight the ones that are most important as we think about a development code. So one is adopt a local affordable housing goal. The second one is to create a dedicated revenue source to help address housing challenges. 3 and 4, where we get into development code related ones. 3 is to update the zoning code to reduce barriers for more diverse housing types. It doesn't mean we want to stop building single family. It means we want to create opportunity for other types as well. 4th is to codify development incentives for affordable housing. So thinking about how can we incentivize affordable housing to be built in conjunction with market rate housing, and also how can we make life easy for our majority affordable builders like Habitat for Humanity, Elevation Community Land Trust, Low Income Housing Tax Credits, the Housing Authority, those types of things. Moving on to 5 is consider an inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing ordinance with incentives and offsets. That means the inclusionary housing is a little bit different than a voluntary incentive in that it mandates affordable housing production, but it can be paired with incentives and offsets to help ease that pain and make developers whole. 6, allocate publicly owned land and or strategically acquire vacant or underutilized properties for affordable and mixed income housing. 7, support acquisition and rehab that creates or preserves affordable housing. 8, improve access to and awareness of regional housing programs, and if possible, bolster those with local resources. And 9, and finally, continue to advocate for regional collaboration and partnership development. So just to reiterate, of those recommended action items, 3 and 4 are the ones that relate most closely to the development code efforts that are currently in process. And specifically to help assist and kind of provide some additional context for those efforts, Root also, as kind of an addendum to the housing needs assessment, conducted a feasibility analysis specifically for both voluntary incentives for affordable housing, but also a potential inclusionary housing program. What would that look like in terms of if we ask affordables to contribute this from a mandatory perspective, what would incentives and offsets, how much would that affect their bottom line? Feasibility is generally important when we think about these market-driven programs, because we are by definition in these types of programs leveraging market rate development. And so feasibility plays into that, because particularly for a voluntary incentive, if we're saying, hey, we'll give you something if you give us something, those only work if they're attractive, right? If they make developers better off than they might have been otherwise. So feasibility starts to become really important in terms of the viability of a program. So what is a feasibility analysis? It's essentially where we create kind of sample or example pro formas for development. So looking at the full development costs under kind of your base development code construct and say, okay, this is what it would cost to build something by right on this parcel among a couple of different housing prototypes. Then we say, what happens to that pro forma if we give you some development incentives? So let's say we give you a parking reduction or we give you a density bonus. What happens if we do that and we also require a set aside of affordable units? So we basically play with kind of the returns and the costs to see how do those net out in terms of the bottom line for the developer. It's not critical when we do this that we have exactly the right pro forma for baseline, because what we care about is not the numerical return, but the change in return to a developer when we go from kind of the baseline to the affordability package and incentive. So we need to have a roughly correct pro forma, obviously, but we're never going to get exactly, every development is different. So the goal here is to kind of get that rough estimate of what does a pro forma look like and how does it change if we add some affordability requirements and also some incentives. If you've got a question, go ahead, Carl.
I was wondering what kind of thing we have in the code next to encourage the affordable housing. Do we have anything in there?
Yeah, great question. And I'll, Chris, feel free to jump in as well. I'm going to show you kind of some of the initial incentives that we tested for inclusion in Code Next. Some of these have begun to shift as we've continued to have conversations, but I can give you kind of a rough idea of what we've looked at so far. And then Chris can maybe give us an update on how those are moving based on additional steering committee conversations, as well as just stakeholder conversations around what works and doesn't work. So our objective in trying to look at some potential affordability options in Code Next, and I guess before I jump into that, I'm going to pause and say, when we're looking at these affordability incentives, we're talking about income restricted contractual affordability. So not just opportunities to build something that might be like naturally have a lower price point. We're talking about how can we, what incentives can we offer to a developer so that in exchange, they are willing to deed restrict or income restrict specific units. So we're talking about guaranteed affordability at set income levels for that. So what we tested for that, we kind of tested two chunks or two different opportunities. One relates to affordability for in kind of a low density single family type context. And the way that we typically do that is looking at what if we changed, we give you an incentive around lot sizes or even dwelling units per acre or dwelling units per parcel in exchange for affordability. So you can see on this table, kind of this top tier. So the baseline zoning is a single family. We say, we're saying in this attainable housing option, if it will let you build a 4-unit or a 4-plex multi-unit on that same lot, if you make one of the 4 units affordable, either in a for sale context or a rental context. So if you're willing to deed restrict and income restrict one of those 4 units, we basically give you a by right up zone to be able to put a 4-unit on that single family detached. So that was one thing we tested. We also tested smaller lot size for row homes. And so if we let you have a smaller lot size, and then we ask for 1 out of 10 townhomes to be deed restricted and affordable, what does that do to the bottom line for a developer? So that's kind of our low density options that would allow for both deed restricted home ownership options as well as rental. Then we also look at on the multifamily side. So if a site is already zoned for multifamily or multi-unit, we say, what happens if we offer you additional height and or a parking reduction in exchange for guaranteed affordable on the rental side? So that's what we tested on these height bonuses for multifamily. And so in exchange for about 10% of units being designated affordable at 60% AMI, or 15% of those units designated at 80% AMI, we'll give you an extra story and we'll give you a parking reduction. What happens there? So that's what we tested. Those are shifting a bit as we continue to go through these conversations, but the results of this feasibility analysis will at least kind of help illustrate to you the proof of concept on these types of incentives, and then we can kind of play with and tweak the actual specifications as we get into that, as we kind of get all the way down the line, and Kristen can speak to that as well. So I'm not going to walk through all these numbers, but they're in this slide deck, which Brian can share with you all if you want to look at them in detail. But largely what we see is based on those affordability requirements and paired with the incentives that we talked about, we see a positive net return or positive change for developers, meaning they are likely to want to participate in these types of incentives. So if you structure incentives this way, they will, broadly speaking, pencil, as we say, for developers. That doesn't mean every single developer will want to do it. You're going to have some developers that don't want the additional height or don't want the additional density. But this at least illustrates that these incentives will attract some potential investment. So kind of the summary of those findings is that the proposed incentive package does generate this material benefit under typical conditions. Those parking reductions on the multifamily side are really, really critical to making those work. We basically found that a height bonus without parking reductions paired with it is not likely to attract participation in this type of program. And then, of course, as is always the case, a mandatory inclusionary program that has these similar types of incentives and offsets is also feasible. That's going to require participation. If the city moves forward with mandatory, inclusionary, those always generate more units. But at least we know that we can make the developers whole as part of that process if the city chooses to go that way. So our recommendation is that the city does move forward with incentive program as we're working through it with Chris in the code next, but that the city also continue to consider the benefits or discussions around mandatory inclusionary. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Chris, I'm happy to punt to you if you want to give an update on additional conversations about where we are with the kind of incentive package as it's getting into code next. And then Colin, looks like you have a question after that too.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. If you could just go back to the slide where you outlined the tiers, I'll
Sure.
give a brief update of where we're at, and Brian, you can correct me if I've missed some conversations. But essentially that tier 1 is the one where council has been debating whether that would be certain corner lots, whether the lot reduction would be all the way down to 6,000 square feet, or whether that would be a broader application of that. And so that conversation has been going on at that council level for a couple months now, and their direction was to, when we prepare the final code, to prepare it in 2 segments, one that can move along without that issue being decided, and then having the plug-in for wherever that issue ends up. And I think they've also discussed wanting this group's input on that as well. The second one down, the smaller lot row houses, that does start to get into some of the things Molly mentioned that will be sort of naturally occurring. They won't be contractual affordability. They may not hit those price points as you know, the industry standard of 60%, 80%, or 120%, but some of the row houses and smaller lots we're enabling and ADUs as well will be part of that, having diversity. Now, a lot of them we know probably won't hit those price points unless there is an incentive or a contractual obligation, but those are going on in that lower density, small scale building as well. And then tiers 2 and 3 are mainly, as Molly mentioned, the area is already zoned for multi-units, although some of them still have a lot of single family homes. And those pretty much remain intact as you're seeing on the screen here in the current draft. And so you'll see that come back. And essentially what we're doing is we're housing all of these in a either in a subsection. The last draft had it in a subsection of the residential standards, and at the staff level we've been discussing, well, does that sit outside the code as a separate ordinance that plugs into it? And so we will figure that out by the time the next iteration comes through, and that's basically on the council's direction of we want this to come back with 2 separate action items to decide on.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate the update. And Colin, go ahead. Looks like you've got your hand up.
I do have a couple questions, so I'll try to limit myself to maybe 2 and let anybody else that might have some questions go and then go back on. So for this one, are the tier 1 considered, is that the R1 or are those any of the Rs?
The tier 1 SFD is basically the R1s. So that's should we allow the house scale building to have up to 4 units if they can guarantee that at least one of them is affordable. And so that's where that 25% target comes. Tier 1 row house, it would apply in R2 where the row house building type is beginning to be allowed. However, that one was also discussed as, would we allow that in limited circumstances in single family as well as part of that 4-unit building type? So they're blending between R1s and R2s.
And maybe one more and then I'll shift off, see if anyone else. Are these base parking reductions off of our currently proposed or what's existing? I would assume it's what we're proposing.
Yes, Molly, kind of correct me if I'm wrong here, but so we have in the code, we have your current parking rate, which we are filtering based on this bedroom rate. There is a current reduction regardless of affordability that we're offering for transit served areas. It's not as generous as the ones you see here for the multifamily units. Those go even further to reduce it based on affordability.
And just to piggyback on that, to clarify this table, the numbers listed, so if you're looking down there at tier 2, on the parking reduction there, we're saying the net parking requirement would be 0.5 for a 1-bedroom or efficiency, 1 per unit for 2-bedroom, and 1.5 for 3. So that's not a reduction of 0.5, 1, and 1.5. That would be the net parking requirement. So we'd essentially average around a 1 per unit, given the typical distribution.
I mean, nobody else is gonna go. Oh, go ahead, Tina.
Thank you. So I just need to level set a little bit myself to get up to speed after being a newly appointed member. So the 25% target, is that a goal that we're proposing to move toward, or is that already a discussion that's been had by council and others in agreement that that's what we want the target goal to be, that we want to be considering these incentives to get at that 25%? How was that set?
Great question. So the 25% is not necessarily an overall goal of everything's looking toward 25%. The 25% is just the set aside requirement under that specific tier 1 incentive package. And
Right.
the reason it's 25% is because we're looking at an upzone from a single unit to 4 units. And so to get to a whole unit, we need that to be 25%.
Okay.
And so when you look, actually, if you look further down the chart on our bonuses for multifamily, we're only asking for 10% in terms of the set aside there. And that's because you're building at more scale, so we can play with those percentages. We're just really limited in the percentages we get to play with when we're talking about a proportion of 4 units, right? We're kind of like, you get 25, 50, 75, or 100, and that's it. So that's not necessarily an overall goal for the city. That is specifically a goal or a set aside amount here. When we did the feasibility analysis, we did play with those a little bit. So if you think about how these incentives work, the set aside, which is the proportion of units that have to be designated affordable, really moves kind of inversely with the depth of affordability that you want those units to serve. So when we ask for a higher proportion of units to be designated affordable, the developer can only kind of discount those at a lower level. If you ask for fewer units, you can get deeper discounts. If you ask for more units, you don't get quite as much discount. So we're always kind of playing with the set aside for the proportion of units and the AMI levels or the depth of affordability we're trying to serve. So those kind of offset. And this is where we landed based on kind of the AMI targets we want to hit that are included or identified as part of the housing needs, and then what makes sense within that building type or structure.
That helps a lot. Thank you.
Of course.
So we don't have an agreed upon target goal citywide that we're trying to hit for affordability right now.
Correct. And we have recommended that the city adopt that local housing goal after we, or kind of while we were in process with developing these recommendations. Proposition 123 passed. So we were working on this in the fall. Prop 123 passed. Prop 123 does provide some direction for cities that may want to try and access that pot of money for state funds. It basically says, if you want access to this on an annual basis, you need to, as a community, increase your affordable housing inventory by 3% annually on average. So, you know, as we kind of said, hey, you guys need to figure out a goal. There inherently is now some state, not necessarily direction on goal, but we're seeing a lot of communities say, you know what, we're just going to use that state kind of money pot as our goal direction. And so as the city considers that may be a factor, Prop 123 does also designate kind of or set income affordability targets. And it sets those around 60% AMI for rental, and then around 100 to 120% AMI for sale or ownership products. So that's in line with Inglewood's needs as well. So all that to say, I wouldn't be surprised if the city moves toward a goal that helps fulfill that obligation, but the city does not currently have a designated goal citywide, but we've recommended that they consider one.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good recommendation, because I think if we're, you know, talking about potentially changing some of the standards of zoning, especially in those R1 district areas, And we're centering the conversation around, we're making those changes because we're working toward increasing our stock of affordable housing. And then we don't have a target that we're trying to seek. I think that's not going to sit well with the community. So I'll leave that piece there. The other quick question I have is on the parking incentive. How do we balance incentivizing the developers to want to participate through reducing the parking requirements? How do we balance that with assuring that we're developing a broad array of housing stock inclusive of those special needs communities? So those that might require parking, people that might have mobility issues, et cetera.
Yeah, great question. And this comes up a lot when we look at parking reductions and incentives as well. So what we're doing when we offer our parking incentives is not necessarily mandating where parking has to be, but we're just moving the floor for what the minimum that has to be provided. We're just kind of setting that a little bit lower than otherwise. So we're giving a little more flexibility to the developers to say, where is market for parking? The reality in Denver, even in the Denver metro, even in pretty urban context, is developers are always going to build parking because people in Colorado want cars, even if it's just for the weekend. And so even when we see these parking reduction or parking mandates really, really low, we still see developers building at least one space per unit because that's where the market is. They don't think they can lease the development without having some parking. So I would say developers are going to do that. That's not always encouraging to community members. And I understand a distrust of developers thinking that way as well. But we've seen these parking ratios work pretty well for communities. It does not tend to strap, create a lot of congestion, and it still gives opportunity for developers to build more parking if they want to. But it is a really enticing incentive because it not only reduces cost for the developers, but it also frees up more of the land area to be units as opposed to parking. So it is a trade-off. It might mean that more people take advantage of street parking around multifamily, and that's just the reality of it. If we want more affordable units, are we willing to accept a little bit more street parking as a result, or are we willing to accept letting developers kind of choose where the market is going to land? The other thing that I would say is that even in an incentive package, not everyone is going to opt into the incentive. So there's just going to be some developments that say, yeah, I'm going to give you affordable housing and I'm going to reduce my parking. So, but it is a challenge. So let's go Colin and then Carl.
One of the goals that you had was to keep the affordable stock, and how do we do that within any of these principles?
Yeah, so there are certainly preservation strategies, but they aren't usually things that are in the zoning code. So while we are recommending that the city think about how can you preserve existing affordable housing, or both naturally occurring and kind of income restricted, it's not something that you necessarily see a straight through line to your zoning code for. So in terms of preservation, there's strategies around for your income restricted housing, making sure that the city has a first right of refusal if that goes for sale, the city or a nonprofit can purchase it. In terms of preserving kind of your additional affordability or your existing kind of naturally occurring affordable housing stock, there are strategies to do that include both providing supports to existing residents and homeowners in order to stay in their homes. Sometimes that means mobility improvements. Sometimes that means down payment assistance for folks as well. But I would say there is kind of a supply-oriented argument to preserving your existing as well. If you allow for additional development of other product types, you can increase some of the churn in your existing supply, and that helps move kind of right size folks that are in current homes and in newer homes as well. So it kind of keeps a healthy balance as you're adding supply in some of these other categories that you're freeing up. through the zoning code changes and through new construction, that can help preserve and lock in some of that affordability. We also recommend working with, on the preservation side, working with land trust opportunities. So you will see sort of scattered site acquisition for land trusts that help keep the prices or mandate a lower price point, staying on those products as well.
And I might just tag on to that one, Molly. One of the things that we've had in the code that's not necessarily the contractual affordability, but the idea of just diversifying the smaller scale lots. And so when you see the draft come back in the next iteration, staff has done a good job of really putting a finer point on some of those ideas, and have come up with a pretty good strategy to allow some of that development to occur without, being sensitive to, well, if we scrape an existing home and put two back, did we really win because we got two new ones? So we think we have some good strategies that will give some incentives for strategic infill as well, to where an existing home can stay and a new unit could be built, not just in the ADU, but in the smaller lots that could be chunked off for individual ownership as well.
Yeah, great point, Chris. So Carl, we'll go to you.
For the affordability, personally, I don't think the 80% is really gonna do us a whole lot of good. You have nurses and you have teachers, and 80% is still above what they can afford. So you really need to go to 60 and below.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really see a whole lot of developers that are going to want to do that. The other thing,
yeah, you're certainly right. So our objective is to go ahead.
Go ahead. The other thing is the parking. We've got thousands of apartments that are being built or are built in the last year here, and all the developers are putting in like almost 1.5 spaces per unit, and so to me, they don't want to have reduced parking. That's to reduce parking makes the unit not as sellable as it does with 1.5 or even one unit per unit. So to give them an incentive of reduced parking is, they don't really want reduced parking in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a developer, so I don't really know about that, but and the tier table, Chris, could we have that email to the council?
Yes, there's a version of this in the last draft you all were given. However, that draft and this one have since been updated. So we don't have a version that reflects the council's current discussions, but we will shortly. But you could either go to this one in this presentation, or in our prior draft, there was the first iteration of this table that you're seeing as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carl. And I think Kate's got her hand up next.
I just wanted to shed some light on something Carl said. So I can't remember where I was reading this, but developers are seeing way more roommate situations because the economy is so expensive with inflation. So a studio is now for 2 people. A 1-bedroom might fit 3. And so I think that might be why we're seeing more parking at new developments.
Yep, great point, could be.
Just to
Michelle,
follow up on that
go ahead, Chris.
last comment I made to Carl's question, the previous draft, it was on page 5-11 of the residential standards, and it was table 1658. So if you have any trouble finding it, just let me know and we can help you, point you in that direction.
Did you call on me? Is it okay for me to talk now?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, thanks.
And I'm sorry, I was stuck at work, and so I was a little late in joining. So if my comment has already been made, I apologize. To to piggyback on what both Carl and Kate were talking about, is we're seeing all of this extra parking, is that at least at the developments that I've seen recently in the last, I don't know, 2 years in Inglewood, is that yes, they may be building to, 1.5 parking spot per unit, but then they're charging the occupants for parking. And so they don't park there, they park on the street. They don't, there's no way that we can mandate in, a PUD or something that they can have to have the parking for free, but that's what's happening, because it piggybacks a little bit off of what Kate says, is that the economy is going bad and inflation's increasing. So not only are they getting more roommates, they don't have the extra $75 to pay for the parking spot.
Totally.
That's a great point. And to kind of add a little bit, I think, as we see developers, building parking, we're not necessarily saying they have to build this little amount of parking. We're saying they have to build at least this much parking. So we're just in an incentive package. What we're offering is giving the developer more choice, more options in terms of how much parking, so that they can really tailor that to their specific site, to their specific development. We did do a handful of both focus groups and interviews with developers, a wide different types of developers kind of throughout Inglewood and the South Metro, and heard pretty overwhelmingly that they would like to see lower parking standards. We did hear most of them say that they will probably continue to park, at 1.25, and potentially up to 1.5 for some developments as well. So I think what is important here is the incentive value is in letting the developer kind of choose where that lands based on their specific requirements. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to speak to this also. Chris or Molly, you can let me know if I'm framing this correctly, but it feels like a lot of the apartment developments that we've been seeing in Inglewood have been very, very large lot opportunities, where once you go structured, it's pretty marginal to keep adding more levels so that you're adding more units and increasing that ratio. But should we be thinking about this as maybe some of the smaller lot opportunities that we have throughout the city, where maybe you're never ever going to be able to go structured just purely because of the size of the lot? And so sometimes this really does make it or break it in terms of whether it's feasible. Should we be thinking about some of the smaller lot opportunities that we maybe don't see through PUD?
Well, I'll go first. Molly can chime in with the actual facts she sees from developers, but we would say definitely so. In those types of projects, we also find that it's, that break of a few spaces here and there, they can be more, back to her point of being more efficient with the land. So if you can tuck parking in unique spots and just be opportunistic about the parking, including taking advantage of on-street at a really small scale project, and those projects are then spread out over certain areas, that can, you can minimize any off-size impacts that one particular project might have. So the problems we see are really in the larger projects that just have everything concentrated, the buildings, their parking, and then all of the spin-off off-site impacts of the parking as well. It just seems to escalate everyone's unhappiness with that situation. So smaller scale and diversifying helps manage that.
Yep, I agree. I think the only thing that I would add is that as we look at parking reductions and parking incentives, they impact those two types of sites really differently. So if it's a site that's only going to have surface parking, what a parking reduction does is help them fit the development on there in a certain way. It also may help, it could, as you say, like the space required for a couple of parking spaces may make or break their ability to get that parking done. So they're thinking about it mostly from a space allocation perspective. On a development that's going to have structured parking, a parking incentive is mostly a cost reduction. So it costs about $50,000 per space to build structured parking. It's quite expensive, and that varies a little bit depending on whether you're how much of it's above ground versus below ground and all of those sorts of things. But that can get really expensive really fast. And so parking reduction there saves money. Whereas on the lower scale stuff, it really helps just in terms of the actual design and layout. Any other questions? Go ahead, Carl. I think
There
oh,
we
there you
go. Sheridan is, the last I heard, they were building a 149 unit building with a, what was it, 30, I think 30 to 60 AMI. How do they do that? How does that happen?
Yeah, so that's going to have public subsidy involved in it. So it's either a low-income housing tax credit project, which means they get an allocation from the Colorado Housing Finance Authority or from the state that essentially subsidizes the project. So it's either low-income housing tax credit or it's being provided by a housing authority who receives funds directly from the federal government to help subsidize that project, or another nonprofit. So there's essentially no way to build that much affordability at that deep of that deep of an AMI without some kind of just cash or essentially cash subsidy on that.
So how does Inglewood do that?
Yeah, so allocating funds, you do have an active housing authority that can help and has done some of those types of deals. But it always helps if the community itself, if the city is able to help provide some gap financing. So oftentimes, even with a subsidy, there's a you know, kind of a gap that in terms of financing. So we see a lot of cities actually allocating some additional funds to help get that deal over the finish line. Certainly offering some incentives to those types of deals to make sure they can really maximize the number of units they're putting on the site as well. So having some incentives that are really tailored to, you know, developments that are going to be majority affordable, have some other subsidy helps as well. But broadly speaking, it's help make those developers' lives easy in terms of process and commit cash subsidy to it if at all possible.
So does the developer have to be given the land and then given tax breaks, or is that just
land donations are really common, so that's a great way to do it. That certainly helps subsidize it. We see fee rebates, potentially tax incentives are a little bit tricky in Colorado. We make those really hard at the state level, doesn't like them. So those are not used very often here, but land donations, other subsidies, and then, you know, again, kind of development incentives. So allowing for more density, allowing variances on setbacks and that kind of thing as well. But in terms of kind of the big ticket items, yeah, you know, land donations are huge. So really looking for publicly available land that the city could potentially repurpose. And that's one of the, we did recommend that as an evaluation for the city to take a look at what land is owned by whom that could be potentially be repurposed, as well as looking at some working toward kind of having discretionary funds that can help get those over the finish line.
okay? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then I think we've got a question for Bernie and Brian. I'll just kick to you to say, feel free to cut off me if needed, if you guys need to move on to other things as well. So I'll defer to you on that, but we'll go to Bernie with a question.
Yeah, I think on some of these smaller lots, smaller project-based options that we're talking about, as far as an increase in you know, sort of what I would call low scale density, I think including some flexibility in vehicular access for whether it's, you know, covered or uncovered parking would be something to really dial in, especially on corner lots and things of that nature. I think it would open up some greater opportunities for some project types to fit into the scale of the neighborhood, and then also allow for some flexibility with parking. So just a thought when I'm thinking about the reality of some of these, you know, when we isolate vehicular access mostly on the city lots from alleys, it does sometimes, you know, cause repetition and what kind of product can be done. So if we're looking at, allowing for some diversity in product types in this missing middle kind of density, I think allowing curb cuts and strategic, thoughtful vehicular access should be part of that discussion.
Great point. Any other questions on the housing needs assessment or incentives? Oh, Brian turned his screen on, so he may be cutting me off.
No, I didn't see any more hands coming up. I did want to touch on something that Chris brought up. I know that we had talked about the 2 to 4 units in R1, and then council had kind of asked us to put that one in its own separate bucket. And then when the Senate bill was announced, council asked us to pause that bucket. And I understand that at last night's council meeting, there was some discussion of completely removing that piece from consideration. I haven't made it all the way through the meeting, so I don't want to comment too much to say where it landed. But that may be coming down the pipe, that 2 to 4 unit discussion may be completely removed from our consideration. So just a heads up, I'm trying to get through that meeting so I can hear everything that was said on council's direction, but just wanted to provide that information to you all as well. Bernie, I think you still have your hand raised. I don't know if you have another question. Okay.
I don't. I'm not
All right.
showing my hand raised, but yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks. Well, thank you, Molly.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate the time, and I'll leave you to the rest of your discussion.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
All right, Chris.
All
We
right.
will turn it over to you.
So what I had planned to talk about was just, I was not at the last meeting where you all discussed the bulk plane issues. And so staff filled me in and updated me, and then we met and discussed some possible options and follow-up directions. So I'm going to walk through those where we landed. So just by way of summary, last meeting you talked about 3 different options to the current standard. One was where the current draft sits, which is a modified bulk plane of your current plane that just starts to whittle down the building envelope the more you have an exception into that plane. So that's something that could give a little variety and variation while still meeting the interests of protecting adjacent lots, and particularly the rear portions and rear yards and those types of things. The second option was basically the 2-tiered bulk plane, where there's a different one in the front and the rear, and adjacent communities use that. And then the third was returning back to one of the original concepts we had in the initial draft that was brought to you all, that what if we just thought about the bulk plane and sheer quantity of wall planes and had 2 different standards. And so we had some pros and cons of each of those. And I think they're shown here. I won't necessarily go through all of them, but this was basically the bulk of your meeting last meeting. And so where we landed was a hybrid of the first 2, the modified bulk plane and the 2-tiered one. And where I say we landed, that was with conversations with staff over the last 2 weeks. So this is the concept we're working on right now. And we do have a few questions for discussion with you all, but essentially what we would do would be set a bulk plane on the front portion, the front 60%, which basically takes most property back to the 75-foot line of the lot depth, and you have 125-foot lot depth. And so that's in the older kind of pattern of building, that's essentially your principal building footprint. Now, as you add on to buildings and building footprints become larger with modern needs, they can stretch back to that because your rear setback doesn't really kick in till 20 feet. So further back into that second 40%. But what would happen would be either those are accessory buildings or they're a reduced height wing or addition to the building is the idea. And then we went ahead and refined your current exception to target it more towards architectural features, things that we would commonly see encroaching into that bulk plane. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the benefits of this were, we got both of the benefits of the the first two options, right? It's a fairly simple concept that people are familiar with. The two-tiered option people are familiar with because it's what Denver uses. So developers in the area will be familiar with it as well. And then we think we improved on it by targeting the flexibility that you currently give. You currently have an exception that says for any linear 15 feet along that bulk plane, you can go to the building height. And so we converted that to a square footage amount so that it would allow people to maybe spread those exceptions out, add architectural features or things that vary the massing a little bit. The cons are still the same cons, that anytime you address this issue, we're putting people into an envelope, so to speak, and we still may be forcing sort of that long and narrow and tent-like effect. But we think we've really come to an area that gets the benefits of that last option we first entertained, which was, letting people have an allocation of space and then let the chips fall where they will, as long as everyone was operating under the same rules. So just to show what we think that could result in, as an example, there's several different, let me back up a moment. Well, actually, I think I have it on the next slide after I go through these examples. But essentially the idea is that those orange things are things that would be exceptions or encroaching into the bulk plane. And if we go back to your first, where you're at currently, it's essentially that top picture there that you say for 15 linear feet, you can go up to the height limit. And I think there's, probably they could spread that out. I don't know how staff interprets it, but maybe it's 2 7 feet lengths or 3 5 feet lengths. But by putting it to a square footage, we feel like we've allowed a lot more things to happen. And so we have basically an exception on the front and an exception on the rear bulk plane. And these are just some examples of the massing variation that could occur. So now to the specifics. When we have some discussion items for you all. When we started playing with this concept, the first question that came up was, well, do we want 2 different bulk planes or 3? You currently have 2, 12 and 17. At the staff discussions, we feel like the 15-foot one really has some merit because it seems to serve a lot of interest, and we can still fit those 1 to 4 unit buildings that we're talking about into that. And so it's more of a question for all of us to decide on. But the draft table there shows where those might shake out. If it went to 12 and 15, we could see the R2B and the MUR3 using that 15-foot bulk plane for these 1 to 4 unit buildings. And if it was 12 to 17, it would basically be similar to what you have right now, with the new addition just simply being the rear bulk plane being lower. The second discussion item is with the exceptions. So one of the things we had discussed was, with the exception, let's not just give it away. In other words, in exchange for encroaching into the bulk plane, we want to see something different. So what we tried to do was target it, in addition to converting it to square footage, we tried to target it to common architectural features and not just a bulk of building that could go up into it. We've talked about some of the stairwells that access rooftop decks as being things that are maybe less desirable than some of the other features that you might commonly see. So those size limits you see there are scaled to a typical gable span for certain building heights. So that's why it's actually higher for the smaller bulk plane. So the 12-foot bulk plane has a 225-foot exception. That essentially equates to your current 15-foot width limit up to the height. But we would be allowing them to shape it differently. And then the higher you get, the smaller those exceptions get on the front bulk plane, that middle line that you see here. And then for the rear one, that 75-foot reflects what could typically fit in a span of a 24-foot wide building. So a typical detached garage, if they had a side facing gable, that would probably fit within that exception. Or it could be dormers on the upper level as for an accessory unit, as we saw in some of the modeling examples. The bigger question with this is, if you've been reading some of the things we have over here to the right, is in exchange for allowing that exception, we want these last 3 points. We want to make sure that we're resulting in less overall massing of your building. So it's more of a qualitative analysis and a quantitative. If you remember in that original draft, we said, oh, well, for each certain square footage you encroach into the bulk plane, reduce your building footprint by increments of 5 feet. That got a little technical, complicated, and kind of wonky, a little bit hard to track than we wanted. So just the idea of just a one threshold of here's your exception, and you need to prove that you've laid out a building footprint that has less mass than could have otherwise been built under the bulk plan. In other words, you didn't max out in other places and also ask for the exception. So it's more of a qualitative evaluation. And so I think I'll just pause there. I'll go back to these models back and forth as we discuss, but those are kind of our questions of if we're on the right track with what you discussed last week with this hybrid option. And Brian, I know you have some images to share as well. I don't know, maybe this is a good time so that people could envision them even more than the modeling that we've done.
If you'll stop sharing your screen, I'll share mine and show. We did kind of a Google Earth windshield survey of town to look for examples of dormers that we could find on some newer and some older developments. So let me pull mine up. And so it's just, I only have one slide that shows 6 different types of dormers that or 3 different types of dormers, 6 examples that we found in the community. So we have the top left, we have 3 gable dormers. You know, they were likely 5 feet to get their 15-foot exception. And the top middle, we have a shed dormer, which is the one closest to you in the foreground, and then the gable dormer, the background. Top right is a gable dormer. Bottom left are 2 gable dormers. Bottom middle is a shed dormer, and then the bottom right is an example of a hip dormer. These are all all of these are examples within our community. And this was just mostly in the northwestern section of the city. So north of Hamden and west of Broadway, the majority of where we had gotten to provide these. So if y'all want, I can bring those back up again for conversation with Chris. Just let me know and we can switch back and forth between our presentations. Brenda, did you have a question?
Yeah, or help me understand something. So I think it was item number 4 for discussion. Did it say lower gets more?
Yes.
The 4th one, lower gets more. Yeah, can you go back to the dormer question and maybe explain that to me?
Yeah, where we started with on that one was, if you would imagine the 12-foot bulk plane, essentially it's about 17 feet at the side lot line. So if there was a 1.5-story building or even a 1-story building that had a side gable that spanned maybe 30 to 40 feet of building footprint, that they would probably need more of an exception because their bulk plane's simply lower. So that's why the number started at 225, which is essentially it would be your current exception up to the height limit. And then we decided to get smaller from there because the bulk plane's essentially higher. So that's the logic behind it. It probably could use a good vetting from you all.
Carl?
For the square footage versus a linear footage, how does the city feel about that? The city is going to be doing the permits and enforcing the codes on that. Do they have a feeling for which way they want to go on that?
Well, I see that Brooke's hand is raised too. So I'm going to bet he's probably going to say the same thing I am. From an administrative standpoint, the linear foot is much easier for us to administer than going in and doing the square footage. Brooke, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yes, thank you. I would agree that the linear footage is definitely more simple, but I also think these exceptions are not always taken advantage of. And I would like to explore looking at it at it from a square footage standpoint, because there are differences. If you take a dormer all the way to the maximum height of the building, that's a lot different than a little eyebrow sort of dormer. And I think I think there is some potential for that. You know, the real goal here is to allow some more flexibility from a development standpoint, but to do it in a measured way, and also create some architectural sort of interest. I think what Chris has proposed here with the lower bulk planes having a greater exception is really good. And from what I've seen of this, and I just want to talk generally for a moment, everything proposed here, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is less than our current bulk plane. So for instance, if we look at the left side of the table in the R1A and R1B with the 12-foot bulk plane, the exception of the 225 square feet, that would be a dormer that is as high as the maximum height. And then they tend to go down from there, sort of in concert with the ability to have a higher bulk plane. One thing I think, Chris, that maybe you didn't mention, like I said, I think this entire table is more restrictive than it currently is. One thing you didn't necessarily highlight is that there's a proposal to lower the maximum height from 32 feet to 30 feet in all these districts for 1 to 4 unit buildings. So I think that's important. That's just a 2-foot overall reduction. And then that's in the front 60%. And then in the rear 60%, we currently don't, although our accessory structure height limits are less, meaning 16 feet for a garage, 26 feet for an ADU, certain other heights for storage sheds, and we need a little more detail there, but the maximum height is also reduced, at least for the principal structure, in the rear 40% down to 25. So from 32 to 25. So that's another reduction. I think the height at the side lot line of 8 feet, maybe we might need to discuss that a little bit more, because I think I thought we were at a different number than that, but let's not focus on that. I think the bigger discussion is these bulk planes, and all of this is a reduction. We've also talked about there's some nuances with enclosed stairwells, but I don't want to get too into that right now. Other people have questions, but I agree with Brian. It's a little more difficult to have it in square feet than lineal feet, but I think there could be some merit to that. So thank you.
One other thing is for the bulk plane, I'm for going with the 12 and the 15 feet, and then eliminate the 17. I mean, it's only 2 feet, but it actually makes quite a bit of difference.
Yeah, the other thing I will add on to that is, so that's mainly going to impact the R2 and MUR3 where those would apply. And I think the fact that we're shifting this to applying to the 1 to 4 unit building types, but that the ones that tend to be more problematic in those upper districts would be the 5+ unit types. And you know, the other thing that we're not talking about in this conversation is the fact that we're also recommending a step back requirement for anything over 24 feet for those buildings, so that they would be inset a little bit on upper stories where they're allowed, which is mainly, you know, we have that 30-foot height limit all the way up to the R2, but when you get to the MUR3s, there's a 40-foot. And then related to the discussion we had earlier, perhaps there are some height bonuses that come in for affordable housing. And then also in the MUB and M districts, you have the 60 and 100-foot height limits. And so we are looking at those step backs of upper stories in those districts as well.
Interesting, thank you.
Andy?
Yeah, thanks for showing some more of the examples about the types of exceptions, because I think that speaks to some of what I've heard from folks. Because down, at least in my part of Englewood, the ridge lines on some of these gabled roofs run parallel to the front lot line. So some of these would be able to fit, I think, a little bit more of the style that folks are expecting to see, and maybe not seeing some of the bulky things that folks are reacting to. So it's nice to see some of those different types of exceptions beyond just some of the dormers.
Colin?
What might be good to understand is maybe some of the typical housing that has been constructed lately, what would and what wouldn't work under these. Might be a benefit to letting us see some of those restrictions that might come up. I think would be helpful. But then one other question that I had was on the previous slide, the additional criteria. So the adjacent number 2 improves the relationship to the adjacent lot, considering massing of adjacent buildings and preserving light and air, and kind of wanted to understand what that meant and how that was going to be interpreted or implemented.
Yeah, I'll go because this is our working draft and it hasn't been even vetted with staff yet. So to some extent, I'm springing something on them. So that's the qualitative versus quantitative analysis, right? And then our administrative adjustments where we had flexibility built into the code, there were some interpretation issues. This references the criteria of 16.211, which is a process to consider adjustments. But essentially, to get to that F2 question is, you would typically like to see mass to mass relationships and open to open relationships. So that would be one way to look at it. So if you're going up against a building that already has a massing element and that's where you're putting yours and therefore you're preserving openness where there's openness, that might be a way to say that, yeah, that's improving the relationship to the adjacent building. Now we are familiar with other areas of where they kind of do the opposite, where one building has a mass and then there's the open space of the other, and it creates more of an enclosure space. So that's something that would almost do the opposite. And so I think it might be a site-by-site analysis, but you're right to pick up on that and question that, because kind of what I've explained is about as far as we've thought about how that might impact a particular decision.
And would there be maybe a way, and I don't know if this is even really realistic, to limit them to, I guess, would it be the south side of the home, so that you're not blocking the light, at least coming on the north side? I don't know if that would look weird that every house had the dormer on one side, but just as a thought.
Yeah, and I think we've in a similar, I'll have to go back through our drafts, because I think the other aspect that's affecting these criteria is we have design objectives and intent statements. And I know, at least in our landscape standards, we had that discussion with this group about, that's hard to write a particular standard to, but let's at least have a performance criteria, not only for the light, but for the the snow melt and the shadowing and that type of thing. So we can go back and see if that criteria might be helpful as well.
Bernie?
Yeah. Okay. Here's the other side of the equation. I think the biggest thing with bulk plane is where you are measuring it from. Typically, I'm speaking mostly for single family and duplex and smaller scale development here in Englewood. There's a middle lot spring point, which is the starting point for where that, in this case, 12, 15, or 17 foot is calculated from. And having built numerous homes, both in Englewood and Denver, it becomes challenging when there's any sort of grade on the lot. And so I would I would say that the 15 foot is probably workable in most cases, but if you're looking at, let's say, a typical duplex, it does present some challenges. And it's one of the reasons why the bulk plane was raised slightly in the past to allow for standard construction and the realities of what a pretty basic, plate to plate levels are, what floor depths are, and what the ever increasing heel of rafters and or trusses are, so that you can at least start to get the basics of the home at that spring point, at that setback under the bulk plane. I'm okay with looking at lowering the height. I just think we need to be careful in making sure that real applications are being taken into account, and not assuming that every home is going to be some sort of traditional gabled roof with a dormer on the side of it. I will say 8 foot is way too low in the rear for even a standard garage, especially with the new alley requirements for any detached garage. We're typically raising, depending on where it's calculated from, if it was based at a rear property line, 11, sometimes the garage is only 3 feet, 3 to 3.5 feet off that property line. So it's hard to get even a low standard garage plate underneath that. So just a couple things to consider. I understand what the intent is here, but with many years ago when the bulk plane was 12 feet and you had a linear allowance for projections into that, it was a lot harder to make anything work. I would argue that it made it much more expensive to build. I think in some cases the results resulted in maybe more interesting side elevation architecture, but I'm not sure if we go too low. I think we're starting to really challenge the realities of standard building practices.
Yeah, great points, and I appreciate them. I want to address two. First, on the rear one, the math you did was the math we did on the and kind of assuming our starting point is a flat lot, but knowing that they're not all flat. But we took that 3 foot setback and said, well, that's an 11-foot wall, and we're assuming that the grade issues could be addressed by interpretation, so that we wouldn't unnecessarily ding where it would have to go. But that 11-foot wall, and then with the exception, the models we did, we were like, well, you could even do a 24 by 20 side gabled garage at 11 feet, and then with the max peak crouching above. But obviously a finer point needs to be put on that, and particularly from people like yourself that have dealt with the issues in the field. The second one on the floor plates and that 15 foot, I just want to throw this out there. And again, this one hasn't even been discussed with staff, but one of the reasons we went to the square footage would be, let's say you take that 175 square feet, under these kind of qualitative criteria. If you were in a scenario where you just went, I'm going to allocate that at a 2 foot additional height over a 3 foot additional height over a 30 foot span. And then so you're left with a 30 foot building footprint that only goes back to the 55 foot mark, or I'm sorry, 55 foot mark, but you went 3 feet higher to address that plate issue you've addressed. Our thought is that would meet these kind of criteria, because you could say, well, I didn't even go back to the 75 foot limit with my bulk plane. I just went 3 feet higher along the wall edge to address that plate issue you're saying. So that was one of the flexible elements that we thought would fit in here. But it certainly needs a lot of eyes on it to troubleshoot it.
And if y'all don't mind, I wanted to ask Bernie a question. If the midpoint of the lot is not the appropriate place to start your bulk plane measurement from, then what would you say is?
Well, I think the midpoint is better in most scenarios than what Denver currently has. Denver's is a little tedious, and I would not always necessarily look to Denver for examples. I think in spirit, yes. In execution, it gets way too complicated. So I think the midpoint is good. But let's say that you have a lot that has 10 foot of fall. Well, there's going to be scenarios where that either works in your benefit if it's going front to back, or works against you in one. Now that we're splitting the lot into sort of an A and B portion, it's going to hurt one of those areas. So I think something in there that addresses, let's say, more than 5 foot of fall in each section of the lot, the front 60% and the rear 40%, that maybe allows for some flexibility would be great. The other thing too is that we're starting to raise foundations higher and higher. So the top of the main level floor is going up because we're having to deal with more aggressive drainage slopes and swales alongside lots. So, I mean, if the top of the floor is 2 foot above, let's say the low point of the grade, and you have a 9 foot plate, 14 inch and 14 and 3/4 inch floor, and then even a 8 foot plate, a lot of times we're building with rafters. So you're really looking at 9, 10, 19, 22 feet at that, where that just a standard 2-story home starts to come into play. And I think on some lots, it will start to become really tight. The other reason I say this is because a lot of times when I'm designing and building homes, I'm actually trying to get the overall mass of the building down, meaning that I'm trying to keep the roof height down, the roof pitch down as much as possible. And sometimes in order to do that, you need a little bit more height at the actual plate, at that setback, at that bulk plane. So there's trade-offs. And if you're building with standard truss construction, sometimes you can get that lower, but with the energy codes ramping up and with the additional keel heights and insulation requirements, drainage requirements at the foundation, I think what we're going to wind up with is a bunch of step backs, which I know is what in theory sounds good, but in execution, you're going to get the minimum step back to fit underneath that bulk plane. And it could potentially lead to some odd scenarios, especially on lots that allow for 2 units and things like that. We've dealt with this in the past. There's ways around it, but I think sometimes the best intentions don't necessarily yield the best results. So I don't think allowing somebody to have a standard 2-story home along the setback is too much to ask for from just a basic property owner's perspective.
Thanks. Brooke?
Moment. Oh, sorry. There we go. Wow, Bernie, that is, you are an architect for sure. Very good. Those are great points. And yeah, I think, I do think I'm glad we have this administrative adjustments, because I think some of that would need to be taken into account in terms of, where the bulk plane is measured from. City of Inglewood is midpoint. I believe City of Denver is at the front setback line. And that can, as Bernie said, when you get into situations like we've seen with duplexes and 2-unit sort of townhome development on Lincoln and Sherman and these very highly sloped streets, it can create some different outcomes. And so I think we need some flexibility. I don't know that there's a better, I think you either have to go from the midpoint or at the front setback line. I don't think there's anything necessarily better, but having some flexibility in there, I think is important. In terms of the sort of 2 versus 3 planes, the 12, 15, 17 or 12 and 15, I don't think going down to a 15-foot bulk plane in the R2 and MUR3 in the 1 to 4 unit buildings would kill development. I think it would. I don't think it would kill development. I think architects are creative, and with exceptions, they can do a lot. I do think as we talk about affordability, it does get more expensive, as Bernie said. There's different, and we talked about them at our last meeting. I believe we gave some presentations on sort of techniques architects can use, recessing the first floor joists, using scissor truss and vaulting ceilings on the sort of the top floor. So there's techniques that can be used, but those are all more expensive. So that's why there was a proposal for those 3 bulk planes, potentially keeping the 17-foot in the R2B and MUR3 and MUR3, but going down to a 15-foot bulk plane in the R1C and even lower, and keeping it at 12 in the R1A and R1B. And one of the main reasons that what's critical in the R2B and MUR3 is that if you're building townhomes, width is important. And so with that width, that has more impact on the bulk plane, whereas in the R1s, you have more width to play with. And so you can move away from that bulk plane in terms of your setback, or even a second story sort of setback. And then I do think it's perhaps there's some potential in a different exception for north versus south side in terms of exception. I think that again is more complicated for staff and developers, but it is true that, you know, obviously there's a difference between effect on solar access south versus north. And then lastly, I think, yeah, in terms of the rear 40%, I do think we'll just sort of revisit that and have a internal discussion and bring hopefully something back to you guys and refine that a little bit more. But I do think having a difference between the front 60, rear 40, and even that 60-40 number may change, but I think that's important. And I guess overall, I'm encouraged that we're really talking about some finer points here. I think this is not wildly on polar opposites of what the steering committee is talking about and what's being proposed. And that, I think that's encouraging that we're starting to hone in on things. So that's all I have.
The other thing I would add, Brooke, to summarize is I think that idea of when there is a grade change of more than 5 feet or whatever the number is, I think we can certainly look at putting in some rules that go, okay, that's a different scenario and we don't want unintended consequences to come. So there might be some things we can do with that concept as well.
I agree.
Brenda?
Right, unintended consequences. Because when I see exceptions, I get very worried, especially since you just brought up something that I didn't even think of. And that is that buildings, especially in my neighborhood, in my MUR3B, they are having to start higher because of drain off. So it didn't even occur to me when you were saying that the height limit is 30 feet, but this thing can still be a lot taller. The building is 30 feet, right? But that's not ground to ceiling. Am I right? That's just the building. They can move it up quite a bit. Am I right? They can start.
If I could answer that question very quickly, no, it is a bulk plane is determined from the average of the midpoints of the 2 side existing property lines.
The average of the midpoint. See, I'm going to tell you something here, and this is why we need pictures. You guys are architects and you're experts. We're volunteers in the community. So so much of what you just said is not understandable, and it's kind of a little unfair. So please, as we move forward, you have an example in Denver, please bring a picture, because I can get what you're saying with the midpoint and the 2 levels, but you guys, you and Brian and Chris there are going into areas where the words do not make much sense, because I am not an architect. So I'm sorry to have to say dummy this down, but you need to dummy this down, please.
No. You're exactly why I'm asking. That's why I'm asking the questions of Bernie. That's extremely hard for us to explain to the average person. extremely hard. So if there's a way for us to simplify it, that's what this group is here for. You know, we can simplify that to, if it's, you know, somebody feels it's appropriate to do it at the front setback or somewhere else, that's much easier for us to explain to someone than you have to go take elevations at the four corners of your lot and then determine the midpoint of your lot in that height and then average that height between that. That's very, very complicated to explain, Brenda. Trust me, we have to do it on a daily basis.
I'm going to want to defend this decision. When at the end of the day, we're going to be facing the public and they're going to say to us, what did you guys do on UDC? And I want to be able to explain it and be able to say, hey, this is, you know, don't freak out. It's not going to be 45 feet. You know, I appreciate working that. And I work in telecommunications. I wouldn't expect everybody to understand laser light levels on the first night, you know, like, oh, you know, measure this light. So I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I understand the concern of your first question, because we do run into it in other communities that have a concern about height. And so the first part is, as Brooke mentioned, is the bulk plane and it being measured from the side lot line. So grading up wouldn't necessarily give you any advantage in that situation. But the second part of your concern that you expressed would be, well, if the building height is measured from where that foundation exists when they're finished grading the lot, could they essentially build up and build a taller building if it fit within the bulk plane? And most, I won't answer because I don't know it off the top of my head where your guys' code stands right now, but we would intend to roll that in whatever you're doing unless we hear it is an issue or concern. But there's two different ways to deal with it. Either you can't grade up and you have to measure building from the existing pre-existing grade. That can create concerns from what Bernie mentioned. Well, sometimes the grade does need to change for legitimate reasons. And so the second way to address that is to address it by measuring the building height, not the bulk plane, but where does that 30-foot height limit start from? Usually comes from, the second way to do it is measuring it from the average grade across the front. So wherever that grade ends to get appropriate drainage, the building height would go across the front is an easy way. That now building code can do the whole perimeter and it gets a little more complicated, as you mentioned, but those are, I think that's the nature of your question. Two part: one, where is the bulk plane measured from? Two, could someone just build a big mound and then their height starts from that point?
Yes, thank you. That makes sense. I get it now.
Bernie, do you have another question or comment?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, no, the intent, what I was trying to explain is that there'd be less height, less constructible area that would fit under the bulk plane. I also think that you can have both. You can lower the overall height, which I understand why we're trying to lower the overall height. I mean, essentially what we're trying to do is preclude people from fitting that third story in, especially on a lot of these, you know, multifamily units or even a single family unit, I would imagine. I think that if the bulk plane is going to be lowered, what's going to happen is you're going to start, and this is mostly in scenarios where you can build duplexes and or what we're calling townhomes and things of that nature. Those end units are going to suffer. I think from a buildability standpoint, they might gain from an architectural standpoint. I'm not sure that's guaranteed. So that was my point. I think the midpoint is way better than the front of the lot. I think having some variation in there just allows for some reality. I'm not trying to stick more house onto the lot. What I'm trying to do is just convey, as somebody who builds homes and is on a job site every day and is designing homes as well, that there are some consequences to all this. And I just think allowing a homeowner to be able to build a standard garage with a, you know, with an 8-foot tall garage door and room for a garage door opener isn't trying to push the boundaries too much. The other thing I would say, and this is something that I'm dealing with a lot right now, which goes directly to what this committee has talked about extensively, is I would look at the height of garages, if the roof for detached garage, that is, or a garage that's in that back 40% off the alley, I would look at allowing some additional height for the maximum height of the roof, because what we're seeing a lot of is trying to get the solar requirements for the home on that detached garage roof. And if we can have a single slope shed roof that has enough height to it, even if it's on a standard 20 by 20 garage, not having to do a gable on the garage roof, or not having to lower that roof into two portions, helps with allowing solar panels to be on the area where they're the most beneficial, which is on that garage area, which usually gains the most solar access. So just another comment based on practice.
Does the current 16-foot height allow that to occur?
Well, you know, if let's say the garage is kind of an interesting question, because Brooke, you might be able to answer this, but right now I believe that the height for the rear is measured at the average of the two rear property lines. This is assuming an alley scenario. So, you know, that the plate for the garage is typically going to be about a foot, meaning that where the standard construction starts is going to be about a foot above that. And that just allows for the driveway to rise above the alley level and for the foundation to sit above grade. You know, if it's a 212 pitch or a 312 pitch, then, you know, you're looking at a 40, you know, a 3.5 foot rise. You're looking at probably going to a 10-foot plate. So it's going to be close. Yeah. And so I'm just saying a little bit of leeway there isn't going to allow for things that people are going to be noticeably negatively impact the neighborhood. But what it is going to do is it's going to allow for people building garages and new development to allow for something that is currently being required in other communities, and that is to provide a solar ready plan to show where solar capabilities would be laid out. And so it's also one less thing that you have up on the top of the home necessarily that would also impact the overall bulk and you know, solar access for neighboring communities. So I think 17 or 18 would probably be better, but it's just a matter of, in a perfect world, you could probably make it work, but you start to get into scenarios where you're really limiting garage door heights and sizes and space for garage door openers and standard construction practices.
If I can make a comment, I think the way our current code figures out height, overall height, be it the principal structure or house or the rear garage, is actually different than how we do the bulk plane. And I think we should have a discussion on that internally, and then, you know, bring that forward. I think it's important for us to keep it simple, but it is a little different, such that in the way we determine overall height is not from existing property lines, but it's from finished grades of the corners of the proposed structure. So in that scenario, it would sort of not necessarily work as well with Brenda's comment, but would actually work pretty well with Bernie's comment. So I think we need to find a way to make a little more sense out of that. But overall, it tends in the real world, in terms of overall height, whether it's a garage or house, to really not be that big of a deal. But I do think we should have some consistency there, but it doesn't tend to be that big of a deal. As far as how a garage, which is true, that's a great place to put solar panels. How that works with a 16-foot maximum height sort of depends on the size of the garage and the roof pitch. I don't know what the ideal roof pitch is for solar panels. Ideally, you want solar panels to be flush with the roof. instead of sort of raised at an angle like you see the old solar water heat panels that are sort of much more intrusive, but ideally they're parallel. My guess is it's sort of a 45-degree angle, but I don't know that to be a fact. So we could crunch some numbers and see how a typical, let's say, 2-car garage works with a good solar angle on the roof, and what roof pitch that is, and then what resulting overall height that is, and see how that plays into it. So that's all I have for that.
Brenda?
Well, my solar panels are on my house roof. I wanted them on the garage, but at the time, my garage did not pass construction specs. It was kind of an old yucky garage before in fact, I'd love to move them. You know, it's important to have solar gain, but we have so many trees in Englewood that I think it would be important for, we say new development, but remember, this is probably gonna be a scrape. It could be either or. And I think what we want is this scrape, let's say, to be able to play with the houses that surround it. So there would be the exceptions, kind of like I almost wish we could do small in front and taller in back. That would be something that they could play with, but we want some uniformity. But I was gonna say it's really important to have solar gain, a big solar person, but you can have them on the roof. I mean, of the house. You'd still have some solar. It may not be optimum, but you'll still have some solar gain. That's all.
Bernie, did you have another question or comment?
No, I don't. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry, your hand was still up. Okay, do we have any other questions or comments from any other members of our commission? Or committee, sorry. Chris, do you have anything else you'd like to go over tonight?
No, I do not. I just really appreciate everyone's in-depth comments and great comments. So, and it sounds like we've got our agenda for Thursday's staff meeting.
Yeah, so I think our takeaway is to try to continue to put a finer point on this, and maybe provide some examples of not only how the bulk plane is measured currently, but maybe some examples of other ways we could do it. And take a look and bring that back to you all. And maybe even we look at how we measure height currently and bring that back to you all as well to try to put a finer point on. I do also want to remind everyone, I'm pretty positive we've told you all this, but the city council has asked that they have a chance to meet with the steering committee. That meeting has been set up for May 8th. We'll make sure and get that information to you all as we get closer. And the agenda gets published, so we know what time we all need to be there. But just keep that on your calendars. That one's going to be a joint meeting between the city council and the steering committee. And what we're proposing to do, I think we had already had a UDC study session item for city council set up for that day. So I think our intention is just to combine the two. So it'll be a big topic on some of the housing items that we've been discussing as a committee, and provide opportunities for some cross discussion between the committee and our city council members. So just a heads up on that. And I want to tell y'all, I appreciate everything you guys do with us and all your input, and we'll keep working. Thanks, everybody. Oh, Carl, you have a question?
There we go. Levy committee or the commission and the steering committee? Like it is tonight.
It's the steering committee, which is planning and zoning commission members plus the 5 additional members. So the whole UDC steering committee and city council on May 8th.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, y'all have a great night.
Thank you.
And
Good
we'll
night.
see y'all
Thank
Thank you, Bernie.
you all. Thank you.